Hello, everyone. I'm Raga De Silva. Welcome to this episode of Older Queer Voices, a podcast where we explore the lives, stories, and experiences of LGBTQ plus people as we navigate aging, identity, and belonging. Today's conversation is truly special. It's about love, family, identity, and the realities of growing older as queer people. I'm joined by Dr. Jack López, a gay trans man, proud birth parent of 4 children from his first relationship, and his current partner, Dr. Iain Armstrong, a gay cis man. Together, they bring us a deeply personal and insightful conversation on the complexities of family, identity, and love. They also bring an important perspective on what it means to age as a couple within our community, to navigate love later in life, and to think ahead practically about healthcare, about care homes, about legal protections, and how we make sure we are seen, respected, and cared for as we get older. This conversation today isn't just about being trans or gay. It's about being human, about how we create family, how we love, and how we make space for the families, for the fullness of who we are as we age. Welcome, Jack,
Hello.
and
Hi,
welcome,
Raga.
Ian. Hi, and welcome, Ian.
Hiya. Hiya.
How does it feel to be on Older Queer podcast?
Seems a bit
Jack,
strange. It seems a rather strange to be on the older. Yeah. I don't find it uncomfortable. Just is.
Just
yeah,
I
it's an
don't. I don't feel that older, but
and
and
Jack, you?
yeah, no, absolutely. I love being here. I think for me as well, although my kids constantly tell me how ancient and old I am, it feels different when you're kind of presenting yourself because I'm sure you might feel this way, Raga, as well. You're always young in your head.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm really interested in the kind of conversations that I've had with people when we've invited guests on our show. And the word older, how it lands differently for different people, that's
can
a
Mm.
really,
some of this going through my head as we talked about it, and I have thought about this before, but it's just reminded me that we might touch on this later in the conversation. That my job is I'm a senior nurse working in a quite a sort of challenging disease area where and one of the things I've learned in the last 20 years in that disease area, what a privilege it is to be able to live longer with health, and that's not being pretentious in any way, but it is something about perhaps where I come from and some of the things I might say in this conversation, that this is a privilege. Yeah.
I'm
And to do
glad
it
you
with
brought
good
that up.
health.
So go on, Ian.
So yeah, and I think that rather than it being it's difficult, it's because lots of people and I was reflecting back as I was driving home today to get here on time for this, that reminded of during COVID, which everything's related in some way to COVID and stuff like that. That taken for grantedness of life, we lost all that. We all lost that to one degree or another, and we've sort of got that back. And this thing about getting older, but getting older with good health and sort of and opportunities, and a really, I feel. Even at my age, I feel this. I'm really excited about the future. I don't see it as a fearful thing, even in the way the world is at the moment. My bit of my life, the bit of my life with Jack and things that we'll touch on is really is exciting rather than oh my god.
Yeah, I love it. I love the perspective. And I think this is what we want our viewers to also understand and listen to. And we'll touch upon all this as we speak. And Jack, I'm really, really excited about speaking with you because I've always been on the other side as a co panelist with you. And so this is almost like getting to know you better. And Ian, I'm so pleased that you're here as well. I can see there's wisdom coming out of you. So let's start. So what I'd like to start with is a little bit about your journeys, and if you can share a little about your journeys as gay men, how your understanding of yourselves and your identities has evolved over time. And I'll start with you, Jack. Then Ian, maybe you can come in
Okay.
later.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think this will be the part of our conversation where we're both, which is quite poles apart in terms of where we've ended up within our lives and where we've ended up together. But I, I lived most of my life from being a very young child, kind of knowing that I was queer, knowing that I had a queer identity. Obviously, as a child, I didn't call myself that. I didn't have the language, you know, and I grew up in a the kind of the interesting thing for me is knowing very starkly the difference from a very early age about my sexuality and about my gender. And I think that's because I was very, very clear and knew very early on in terms of my sexual orientation and my desires and how I felt as a queer boy, as a queer man. Always kind of I never really questioned that. It was settled within me. My difficulty, I think, in terms of it taking a long time for me to own my sexuality is because, you know, I was born with a different body, and I was born as a child that people thought was female, you know, because that's what I was assigned at birth. And I lived in my head, you know, for quite a long time, looking like one thing on the outside and feeling like another thing on the inside. So it was, yeah, it's a really difficult thing to try and break down and explain that I always knew that I was queer. You know, I always used to say in my teens and my early 20s, you know, I spent a lot of time, luckily I was from Manchester, so I spent a lot of my youth around the gay village in Manchester and being around, you know, the queer and the gay community. But because in my earlier life I was perceived as female on the outside, I was thrown into rooms with women. And it always felt really weird. I never quite, I couldn't understand, I couldn't understand why I was there. And I used to describe myself in those spaces, you know, that, you know, people used to call me, they used to call me a gay woman or a lesbian. And I used to find that really weird because I was like, well, A, I'm not attracted to women. So how does, how does that work? And B, like, I used to say, what would I say to people? Because there was no language to talk about gender really in the 1990s in that way. And I used to say I'm not a lesbian because A, I don't like women, and I'm a gay man trapped in a woman's body. I used to say that quite a lot, and at that time nobody turned around to me and just said, Jack, do you think we need to have a bit more of a conversation about what's going on here? That language wasn't there. So I grew up knowing about, you know, my gay identity, knowing that I was a queer man, but not being able to express that, and the world didn't see me as that. So I feel like I've lived a lifetime very comfortable with my own sexuality. Yet I've only been allowed to own that sexuality as an adult. You know, my medical transition into the outside world, being able to see me as a man, began, you know, in my late 30s. So it was only then, you know, and then a few years after that, because it takes time for medical transition for the world to actually start to see who you are on the outside because of the way that your body changes and stuff like that. So it's really weird that my gay identity feels really old, but also really new, because it's only been within the last 10 years that I've been allowed to be around, not been allowed, but, you know, been comfortable being around gay male spaces, being, you know, being able to date and do all that kinds of stuff. So, yeah, I don't know if that's already going around the houses in terms of answering your question.
No, that does. I just want to understand one more thing from this, because you said that there was no language. The queer world, I mean, all of us have grown around having no language, having no role models, having no representation, right? So if there was a language in the 90s, and you knew that there was this language and this is how you identified yourself, do you think you would have come out sooner?
Hugely, because it's about, I think it's, you know, that's why as soon as I had the language, everything went very, very quickly. You know, it was like a boulder rolling downhill. As soon as I had the language to be able to explain to people who I was able to talk to people. There was visibility. I was able to use that language, you know, it's difficult to say because we didn't have the internet, you know, in the 80s and 90s. And that was a big shift for me to be able to you know, get to where I needed to be with the language that I had to talk about myself, because by that time, you know, we've had the internet for the last few years, so it's difficult to know. But I used the binary language as a child. I told people that I was a boy, you know, till I was blue in the face, and that was very much entertained until I hit adolescence. You know, people would just see me as, you know, I'd tell them that I was a boy, they'd nod their heads, they'd say that's absolutely fine, because they just thought, oh, you're just a child, you're playing a game. And then you get to, you know, I think this is quite a common theme with a lot of people who are trans, is that you get to adolescence and your body starts to change in a way you don't want it to change, and also a highly gendered society starts to come in. And people just basically start to tell you cannot be what you say you are, and all the fears around, you know, just teenage and adolescent identity is bad enough at the rest of the times, but you know, when you're dealing with queerness, and particularly gender queerness around that age, you just shut down.
Sure. And see, I think that's why visibility, representation, role models, these
Huge.
conversations, these
Huge.
discussions.
I had
Yeah.
absolutely no role models whatsoever. There was nobody, you know, and I grew up thinking that it was only possible to be a woman, to be trans, because I grew up with examples of trans women, but being able to see men, it you know, there was no such thing. It didn't exist, and therefore, you know, the older you get, and as you go into adolescence and early adulthood, you just start to think there's something kind of wrong with your mental health.
Yeah. I think all of us have been through that thought, isn't it? Ian, we'll come to you, and love to know more about your journey as a gay man. And
Gosh, it's much more exciting, I think. But I mean, the language, I was struck by Jack's sort of use of the language, and then your reference to it. That, forgive me if this sounds a bit odd, and you can ask me questions about it, but I didn't have language that would have described my sexuality till I was late teens, something like that. And it was when, I'll tell you when stuff sort of started sort of giving some context in my head, was probably 18 or 19. I knew I was always, I wouldn't have used queer, gay, whatever. I just would not have been there. And I wasn't particularly sexually active then, apart from, you know, taking it hand. But what struck me about my sexuality that sort of said there is something about me was, and you know, I'm not making a political comment here, it was the Section 28 when that hit the headlines. And I was in my nurse training then, and I remember I was in the student accommodations, and there was a big room with we had a television. We didn't have televisions in every room in those places, and this thing came on about Section 28, and honestly, it was the first time I thought, oh shit, that's me. They're talking about me, and not only they're talking about me, but for the first time in my life, I was sort of being asked to say there's something wrong here about this sexuality type stuff. So what was it? Late 1980s, wasn't it? And stuff like
88
and things like that. I was sort of living in Sheffield, and Sheffield is not known for having any sort of gay community. Even in 2025, you can find the gay community in 2025 in Sheffield, and it's odd. So there wasn't places to be who I wanted to be, but I didn't feel particularly frustrated. I just found, and again, forgive me if this sounds quite odd and a sort of different trip, but I found it quite exciting that I like the idea of being different. And there's something about my personality about being different, not for the sake of being different. I just knew that meant I was different, but it didn't make me feel uncomfortable. Other than I thought, this is potentially quite not. It's a bit dangerous. I was just starting a career, and you know, politically, this was being what they call. I mean, they didn't even use gay. It was being homosexual. Was like, ooh, and it was used as a spitty word, and then followed up not that long afterwards by the AIDS pandemic. So it almost became keep your head down. But I'll just sort of talk about this. What it gave me the opportunity to see sexuality and explore it. Cruising was really exciting because of that. And it was because there wasn't anywhere, not because there wasn't anywhere else. If there was, I probably still would have done some of that activity, because you explore in safe places with similar people, and that's, you know, it's a protective type of thing. And I don't know, I'd have lived in London or Manchester at the time, I might have explored it differently. But and I think also that something about my sexuality, that my childhood was slightly unusual. It is, you know, not a woe is me, but my father died when I was very young, and my mother couldn't care less about me at all. So I had never had this opportunity or this need to please anybody. I didn't have to be anything to anybody, which was, so you learned a lot of resilience in that. But I didn't have to please anybody. I didn't have to explain myself to anybody. And there's a huge amount of freedom in that. And you know, I don't see it as a sad time for me. Just is who I am, and it's because of who I am is related back to that. So I didn't have to please anybody, and then and in some ways there's a real freedom in that. So, and this parenting and this language and expectation, I didn't have to please anybody, but then nobody forced anything upon me for that either. So there was a sort of freedom of it that. In some ways, I'm probably on reflection now really grateful for. It wasn't good at times. I didn't have loads of stuff and didn't have lots of stuff and what have you. But the two things there, so I didn't have a narrative, either a cultural, a societal narrative. Nobody's expecting me to be anything other than me. And then it was only as I got to that age where I actually wanted to be physically expressing and exploring my sexuality that. And it was around that time, and it in some ways the Section 28 and then the gay plague, as it were, came out, and on reflection, none of them were brilliant, but on reflection, it gave me a real opportunity to explore me, and also find safe places for me at the time to do that, which I would never describe them as like dark corners. It wasn't dark corners. It was where it was safe, equal, mutual respect, which I think one of the things that, you know, gay places, etc., are all those things: safe, mutual respect, blah 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 blah, which you tend not to see often or as equivalent in the heterosexual world. So and probably I've always known I was, you know, in the 80s, it was a John Inman thing, it was a puff or something like that, or an homosexual. I love the idea that I'm queer. I think it's really, I love that. I have no problem with that at all. And I'm glad that, you know, we've reclaimed that one, because it doesn't belong anywhere else than with us.
I agree. Ian, so refreshing to listen to you, because all the stories that we've been listening to are people who've really struggled during that time. And it's, I mean, whatever your childhood was, it has shaped you, and it has shaped you into being this person who feels free to be who you are, right? Because most of our experiences has been like, I came out at 50, for instance, and I felt free only when I was 50, and that's completely different experience to your experience.
I was saying to Jack quite recently, you know, I don't think I've ever come out to anybody said I'm gay, I'm queer, I'm whatever. I don't think I've ever done that, because I just haven't had to do that. I am absolutely certain my life is full of people who wondered, is Ian gay? Is he? And sometimes I've had people who've asked me, you know, are you gay? And I said, well, what do you think? What do you want me to talk about? Do you want me to talk about what makes me sexually aroused? Like, do you want me to have that conversation with you? What has it got to do with this? And what this inquisitiveness is that, but I've never, and in a way, you know, again, it's sort of liberating that not only have I not had to do that, I've never felt I needed to justify, look, this is who I am, etc.
Yeah, you're quite an exception in the community. I'm sure you know that. And you should be the poster man for the future of LGBTQ community.
Poster man, Jack, did you get that?
Yeah,
I do, well, yeah, but I do think it, I mean, I'd say it's something that you know, there's been so much learning throughout our relationship. And actually, you know, I was kind of very much under the impression that, you know, I'd grown up all because of, you know, when I was coming into my teenage years around 1988 and Section 28. So actually, it's interesting looking back on it now, not knowing about that silence at the time, you know. So when I talk about there was no language to say who I was, there was no adults to go to, there was no services. it was actually, I think in some ways it was harder, because listening to Iain, knowing that he was an adult navigating those spaces at that time, he had agency, he had choice. It wasn't easy, but he had that agency there. And then I was a teenager in that period, yet at the same time I think my generation has grown up going, but yeah, we had Queer as Folk, we had the Village in Manchester, we changes in legislation, we became protected in the workplace, and eventually in 2003, by which point I'd already left the country, but Section 28 was in the bin and all that kind of stuff. But actually there was a lot of restriction on that, because all of there is a need for labels, but also the obsession with labeling that came out of the later 90s also forced us into boxes. Yep. Which also meant that I just couldn't be, when I read, since I've discovered memoirs of American trans men that grew up in the 70s and 80s, in all the gay male spaces, and there was openness for them in those spaces because they were making up their own language and they weren't sticking to labels. Whereas, where I was around that period, people were looking at what I looked like on the outside, making a decision and an assumption about me and putting me into a box that I didn't fit in. And there was, and you weren't, the community around that time, particularly, in the north and around Manchester, was like, you can be this, you can be that, but you can't be anything else. You're either a lesbian, you're a gay man, they don't speak to each other. There's some trans women in the background, and if you're bisexual, you can go away because nobody trusts you. And it was vicious in the 1990s. And I actually think, that was quite restrictive, and also, just like Iain was saying there, I've grown up with the privilege of a very supportive family, but also a very British working class family that are all like, we accept everybody, but we don't need to talk about it. And that actually led to a lot of me pandering to expectations, and I think which also led to me not really living my truth for a very long time, because I was concerned about what my family's attitudes would be towards me.
Sure. This seems to be a common theme, amongst our community, right? A lot of us have had to, if the family has accepted us, then it is with conditions. Yeah. Right. You've come to a family dinner. Please don't talk about, if you bring your partner, that partner is your best friend or your.
Well, in my family, it's special friend. This is your special friend.
Special. In my family, it was a business partner always. Oh, you're like sisters. Like, we look like sisters anyway. No, but that brings me to the next question, Jack, about, like you've spoken about being a gay man who also happens to be trans. Right? Yeah. And we've had this conversation. How has that shaped your sense of belonging within the wider gay community, particularly as you are getting older?
Yeah, I think it's, I could be really, really sad about, not being able to, have the world see who I am until I was, in the end of my 30s, beginning of my 40s. But actually, I also think about that as I think everything happens at the right time. And I think learning to be particularly around the cis gay male community as an adult, I would have really struggled with a lot of that had I been younger. And I see a lot of younger men really struggling around there. But I just think I've got to a point in life where there's so much other stuff going on. And actually, I feel so, and you might relate to this yourself, when you said before you truly felt yourself when you were able to come out at 50. I think that's when age really becomes just a number, because I just feel like I'm getting to live, the open gay life that I didn't get to have when I was younger. And I'm really confident in those spaces. And I think also those spaces have changed. Yeah. So what was terrifying for me when I was younger in the 1990s is, like I said, the Village was a very toxic place to be. I grew up in theatre school around very stereotypical, very toxic theatre queens. And I get that now. I didn't understand it at the time, but they were head on into the AIDS pandemic. There was Thatcher was in. The world was incredibly outwardly homophobic, and as a defense mechanism, a lot of men were just absolutely horrible to everybody as a defense mechanism. And I think that something shifted there. What I have found is, when I first started to venture out socially, particularly after COVID, I purposely chose gay men's groups for middle age and older men. And for me, it was easier. Just gay men's social group. I started to do a lot with a charity called Outdoor Lads, which is just, outdoor pursuits. And it's all men who want to find friendship, who want to get away from the toxicity of the scene, or they've just outgrown the scene. And what I find is my experience has been incredibly positive, particularly with middle-aged and older men, because they've lived their lives, a lot, especially the first men that I socialized with and got to know were in their 60s and 70s, and they'd been married to women. And some of them had even waited to be widows before they came out. Some of them had been married their whole lives, but there'd been a secret kind of the complexity of my life, what I'd gone through, how I'd been born, and the fact that I had a family and children was not an issue around, men of my age and older. Great. Around younger men, there's a bit, what I find in the younger gay community is they can be on board with gender fluidity, or they know the language of transness, but they still don't really accept it. When one of the things they don't accept, and this is what I found, where I came out into the world and just kind of assimilated into the gay male world, found it very positive, but suddenly then had to start hiding the fact I was a parent. Because all of a sudden in the gay world, especially for gay men, it's not normal to have 4 children. Yeah. And I found that really difficult at first. I found myself almost kind of going back into a closet as a parent, and suddenly realizing I've just swapped one thing to hide for another. And that was something I found quite difficult, because it is a core part of my identity as who I am as well. I'm a dad. I've got kids. I can't avoid that. And yeah, that was a tricky one. And it was definitely a shock for Iain, I think, when we met each other, and I was like, yeah, by the way.
and that's this happens a lot in our community, I know, because as lesbians, most of us have had children, we've been married or have had children, and then to start dating a woman who may or may not be open to having children, so that becomes really difficult. So I understand. So Iain, on that note, you did touch upon your childhood, and you made a mention about your parents. So I just want to know that how is your relationship with Jack and your shared identity as gay men influenced how you think about love, partnership, and chosen family now that you have later in life?
Okay. Well, I mean, just go back to Jack's sort of comment about him having 4 children. It didn't, I've got to say, I mean, it didn't come as a shock. It wasn't like, oh my God, how do I get out of this place? Do I have to go left or right? Something like that. But I do remember thinking, wow, well, let's just see how this goes. And there was, in the beginning of a relationship, lots of stuff is happening. You think, do we, don't we? Is this any good? Is this for the month? Something happening next month and stuff like that. And that growth in our relationship. And one of the things that went through my mind about Jack's family was I wanted to be respectful to his kids. And that was the first thing that went in my head, that not even knowing them at the time, that there was no way, if I was ever to meet, because at that beginning stage, I'm ever going to cross Jack's threshold, his house threshold, etc. But if I do, I don't want to be anything to any of them other than myself. I don't want that. No way at all. I'm not going to arrive with gifts and let's do it. And it's a learning process, and it was a learning process in some ways, partly because I think of my understanding, my background through my childhood was that I had no reference points to that. But what I have had as I've grown up is the ability to meet and connect with some family settings that I found deeply attractive. Okay, there's a few families that I know, I'm not going to mention them here, but that I was loving parents, whether they were male, female, whatever, really happy kids and things like that. And I found it I wasn't jealous of it. I was just deeply appreciative of that type of thing, and how kids in those relationships grow and flourish and flower type stuff. So if there's anything with my relationship with Jack and whatever it could and might not be with his kids, is it just needs to be that. I don't want to be, just to allow them to be who they are. And if I can, in some ways in my relationship with Jack, help him be a dad who enables that to happen. So when we're together, one of the things I do try and do, whether it happens or not, is, because it must be really busy living in a house with 4 kids on your own. There must be something, I've seen it on telly, I've read about it, must be really busy. So when we're together, I do try and, not patronizingly, but to give space and look after, as best I can without it being sickly, that type of stuff. So that's the best way I can support his kids and stuff like that, and find out what makes them tick. And one of the things is things like the cinema and popcorn, which is really good because that fits me as well. So I would never, I'd go to cinema with them because actually I like it myself first, not whether you do or not type thing. So there's something quite good about that. And to support that, and also Jack's wider family, because one of the things that Jack's got is a really wide family. He has contact with people all over the world. Well, I mean, I don't have contact with any of my family. I've got 2 brothers that are older than me. I wouldn't have a clue where they were. And I've no sort of desire to do that. Not in a bitter way, I just don't. But then, Jackson, who's got all this family type stuff, and I've sort of met them. I personally, I'm very fortunate. I think my personality is I don't feel uncomfortable meeting new people. I don't do that. But I do meet them in the sense that I would want to be really respectful. So not barge in and say, oh, my name's Iain Armstrong, and sort of have that respect for them. And fortunately, so far, all of Jack's family and friends are just really nice people. But then what else would you expect from, a guy that you love that is not going to be surrounded by knobheads or idiots or whatever? Do you know what I mean? People, it is, I'm sure he does know, but wouldn't introduce me to them. And it's, that our relationship, one of the things that's grown in our relationship is me. And that's why I think it's good, is that I've grown myself in understanding me, understanding the queer community. You can't help it, but because if Jack, it's a part of the topic and conversation. I've been, for the want of a better word, exposed to stuff and understanding, and I found it really fascinating because it's telling me something about me. I think one of the things I'd like, or as I sort of get older and wiser, whatever it is to support that community better. Because in some ways, I've never done it because I never knew. To be honest with you, I never knew it needed support. I didn't know it needed support. I wasn't aware of that because I wasn't part of it. The Manchester, looking back, as Queer as Folk, when that came out late 90s, wasn't it? And that I saw it, I thought, God, that's really exciting. That's exciting. And I must get to Manchester. Went to Manchester, thought, God, it's a bit toxic and it's full of, it just isn't all that really exciting. But that what's behind it, and that history of it is not only fascinating, but I'd want to be, because those people are me. It's not I want to support them; they're me. And if I can be, this is our problem, not their problem. And people have found it really difficult and find it really difficult to be themselves because of all sorts of stuff. Then I'd want to be in some way part of, but it's just being me. I don't know what it would be, but to be that. But and one of the things I managed to do with Jack and understanding and meeting lots of different places, took me to places that I would never have gone to. And I don't mean that in any salacious sort of way, but
No, we went to the ballet. That's right.
The ballet. I mean, Armstrong went to the ballet. It doesn't do. I've never done that in 60. I've never been to the ballet. I mean, the fact that it was Matthew Bourne and there's these guys in really tight. Anyway, but that's another thing. But you know, you know what I've been able to listen, to understand, and I've never had to do that before. And to understand is fascinating and enthuses me, because it doesn't make me understand myself a little bit better. So
yeah, I think kind of going back to what you were asking, Ragga, in terms of how has our relationship impacted on our identities. I think equally, and for different reasons, we are both consistently evolving and growing as gay men, and I remember, the feeling or the assumption that I would have had was like, I'm in my I'm 48 now. I am, a few years on my own post the breakup of my marriage and so forth. I would have thought that I would have been the novice gay man in the relationship, because I've got into a relationship with someone that's older than me, that's been around a bit longer than me. But I actually, we just had different life experiences as gay men. So it's in the same way that, Iain, having lived and worked in Sheffield most of his life, where there is no big gay community, there's not even a pride in that city or anything like that. And also, he's always had a life with happy friendships and connections, and he's never really had to think about whether a need for a community, because he finds his community in other ways. So I kind of came at it with that, and my identity has been very much formed by my connection to the community and the work that I do with charities and so forth. For me, it's really important. But one of the things that I have really, really learned off him is actually also to that there are spaces where I can go and switch off from that as well. And I was always I separated the gay and the straight world. For me, I was very much out of safety. I'm in this bubble. I don't necessarily want to creep over into the heterosexual world. It's nothing to do with me. I had a lot of, I saw things as a lot of divide around that. And actually that being with Iain has softened those attitudes that I had about straight people, because also I've learned from him in the way that he navigates those spaces. And that actually it's not about an us and them, it's not about divided communities, but he's allowed me to think a bit more about, actually there's room for everybody, and there's room for every bit of everything.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Both of you are saying the same thing, basically. That's it. And that shows that the relationship is going somewhere really cool. Yeah, it's beautiful. So thank you for sharing. Iain, I actually wanted to come back to you on this. And, Jack touched upon that, about his being older now, and therefore the experiences are different. Do you think that you would have been the same person if someone came into your life with 4 children, if you were much younger?
Oh,
Your
gosh.
response? Yeah.
Gosh. I'm not sure how meaningful I could answer that. Because I suppose in some ways what's going through my mind is, was I more ready for Jack now than I would have been 10 years ago? Probably I am more ready for it. I mean, Jack came into my life. I mean, it's like it came on a white horse with sort of, but it didn't. It was none of that sort of shit, really. None of that. But Jack came into my life when one of the things that I think I got to in my age, not my age, my life, was that I'd got something that not many people have got, and that was enough. Okay. And what Jack did, he just added some more to having enough. Okay. Now, probably I wouldn't have been at that stage 10 years ago. for whatever reason. I just wouldn't. I didn't have the life experiences, and the last 10 years has been for all of us a very different life experience than any of us could have experienced and stuff like that. And partly because of my job, the whole thing about COVID sort of changed lots of stuff in my head and things like that. And it's my day-to-day life, and it didn't twist my mind. I just saw things differently. But going from a position where I knew that I had enough, and a lot of people, as I say, don't, and that's why we spend our lives chasing stuff we don't really want. And then Jack comes along, and it's a bit more of the good stuff, even with his family and stuff like that, and kids. And I suppose one of the things I'd learned, I was just thinking back, to both of you, that one of the things I think you do if you've got a family and big families is you learn how to deal with difficult people. So how do you accommodate them? One of the things I don't do, and I suppose in some ways I don't tolerate difficult people. So I've never had them in my life because I've never had to do that in a family setting. So if I would just get them out of my head, I just wouldn't have anything to do with them. And in bigger families and settings, like you're dealing with difficult day to day. Obviously, in my work life, I get paid, I get a salary at the end of the month. I do difficult people. That's my job, and I hopefully do it well. And then difficult people need that. But personally, I won't tolerate difficult people in my life because I don't have to. There's life. That's when life is. What's important in life is not managing difficult people all the time as best you can. And I don't mean people with personal problems and health problems. I think just arseholes.
Sure. No, that's really good to know, because as Jack probably has seen on my LinkedIn post, that I actually learned the skill very late, like just lately, that how not to have toxic people in my life, because I didn't know how to say no. I would just put up with it, that had your own mental health issues you have to deal with, and then until one day you realize, and I think that came to me as an older person. And that came to me as an older queer person, because my experiences as a queer person was so different to my experience when I was married to a man, lived a straight life, completely different. Nobody ever said things to you that made you cringe inside, or hide away. So that's the difference. And what I'm interested, Jack, in this at this stage is, how did you've got 4 children, you've had a different life earlier, they've seen you through your transition. So how have they responded to your relationship with Iain? And has it, like, do you see it evolving? Do you see it as the way you expected a family should be?
Yeah, I think it's been really beautiful, because as much as I kind of learn from our relationship and the way that we are together, my children consistently teach me, and they consistently surprise me. Some of it is a timing thing. Like I mentioned before, I think I was on my own for like nearly 5 years before Iain and I met. So I think the biggest shift for my kids would have been being so used to having me all to themselves, and then there's somebody else there. But by that point, my 2 older ones were that bit older. My younger children don't even remember me looking any different to what I am now, because they were so young at the time that everything changed. It's not even in their living memory. So it was just, and also Iain was the first relationship that I chose to have after being on my own for 5 years. I dated, and I was very happy as a single man, doing what I needed to do, completely because I think one of the first things I said to Iain when I met him was, my life is compartmentalized. You can be here, the family can be there, my work is there. I'd completely compartmentalized everything. And then the more we got to know each other, the more that I realized that this was actually becoming a relationship, and that I wanted it to be a relationship, and that at some point that meant that I was going to have to stop compartmentalizing and bring these things together. I think the one thing that's always helped us, and I think this is a benefit of queer relationships as well, is that you can make your own rules up, and we don't live super close to each other. We live like about an hour apart, or just over an hour's drive apart. So it meant that when it came time for Iain to meet the children, it was a planned and it was a a thought out thing. I think, you know, we went to the cinema. It wasn't come to the house. I was really careful about how the children were with somebody coming into their space, you know, which is the house that I live at with them. And I don't think this is any different from any single parent, you know, and when they first start to see anybody. I don't think being queer's got anything to do with that. What I love is challenging the kind of heteronormative expectations that even my children have, you know, even now after, you know, I think in August we'll be coming up to like 2 years together. And every now and again, because my kids are very used to having friends who live with one parent, whose parents are divorced, they generally tend to live with their mother though. And quite often another relationship happens and it's like, oh, this is the stepdad, you know. So I get a lot of questions, not so much of my older but of my younger ones, because they're trying to place us, they're trying to think about who we are as a family all the time, and they do that in terms of how they relate to other people. So they will come to me with questions like, oh, is Iain our stepdad? And I'm like, well, no, because you've already got 2 dads. Like, I don't think we need a third one in the mix. That's a bit weird. But you can tell for them, they're just trying to figure out who is he then, you know. And we have really good and open conversations to just say, well, this is just Iain, you know, and Iain is my special person. That's who I'm in a relationship with, but that doesn't mean he's about to step into the role to be a third parent to you. And actually what we can do is decide what we want to be to each other together. And I think our queerness allows those conversations to happen. I think if we were straight, you know, it would be too much onto that linear trajectory of, you know, you meet somebody else, you get married, you move in together, you create a blended family or what, you know, and everything, and then things continue as they do. And we have the opportunity not to have to do that. Sure. My kids are like most kids their age as well, is that, you know, sexuality and gender identity, they're so bored of labels and thinking about it that they just don't care. They really don't. There's been no kind of like, there's no, well, from the feeling that I get from them, for them it's so normal for anybody to just be whoever they say they are, that it's not a fear and it's not a problem. And they navigate that quite well. So it's I think it happened, like everything, it happens at the right time. There was no rush, but I say, I think the benefit of the fact that, you know, when you're when you're queer and your family, you know, I often describe my family as a queer family, in the fact that my children are impacted by my identity and the choices that I make as an adult and how we live together. But that gives us a lot of freedom, and what I hope is it gives them the message that as they grow up, you know, there are choices that they can make. They don't have to fit into this kind of narrative that I was given when I was younger, that you have to meet somebody, fall in love, move in together, then get married, then do this and then do that.
So I think with a role model like you, and of course with Iain around, I don't see how they will fit into the societal structures that we have, right? Those heteronormative relationships.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there, you know, it's not because Jack's on the call, but as he's got to know his family, and I know it's not just Jack, because his grandparents and his other dad is all part of that. That Jack's kids, they don't know it at the moment, just how lucky they are to have people around them that love them, and they'll, however difficult they might seem, they'll grow into really good people themselves.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly, Iain. And this is the same with my family. You know, I have twins who are now 27 years old, and they've been brought up by 2 women, raised by 2 women through the last 18 years we've been together, Nicola and I. And I see so much of difference in the way that they speak, the way they carry themselves, the way they are around people, versus some of our other friends, straight friends, you know, who have children. I'm not saying they're not good, but there is a difference. The level of acceptance, the level of tolerance, the level of understanding, and just being. I mean, they can be whoever they want to be. which is what
Absolutely.
I had to learn basically. And Jack, it makes me think about society. And this is your beautiful family, within a new relationship, and it's pretty fresh, 2 years old with Iain, right? You have a certain understanding, you've created a beautiful life, but there is still that society outside of our lives.
Yeah, yeah,
How do you navigate that? And I'm sure there are biases because society is not used to this new family structures that we are so comfortable with.
yeah. And I think that's very much where, for me, it's a lot easier. I think it's a lot easier for us as gay men with children attached for society. Society can cope with that. What society isn't ready for is the fact that I'm a man that gave birth to my children. And most of the time I just think, well, that's nobody's business. But then it becomes, because it's like you said, the way within which society is structured, it ends up being a thing, not because of us, but because of society. Schools, my children are still mostly school age, so coming into contact with systems such as schools, such as anything that involves paperwork, GPs, doctors, there's always going to be questions, as the that it just doesn't compute in people's heads, that they're people always want to know where the mother is. There's always that question, and there's always a look on people's faces to say, like, oh, there must be this evil woman somewhere that's disappeared and abandoned her 4 children, or there's quite often or an assumption that I'm a widow, and it's something that neither me or my children necessarily want to explain to anybody. I would love, and I'm sure the kids would love, us to be at a point in society where I can just walk into a room and go, well, I gave birth to them, and it's like, right, fine, let's move on and carry on discussing that. We're clearly nowhere near like that as a society, and that's what changes. It changes the feeling of safety when you're outside. If you've ever got to explain yourself to anybody, or I've had it at times where one of my children has quite bad asthma, and every now and again they have to go off in an ambulance to hospital, and you're arriving at hospital and you've got people wanting, when they're writing down your children's information and family information, you always have to make that decision. And especially when you're stressed in a minute where your kid's been taken by ambulance and they can't breathe, and there's all that. I think there was another incident a few years ago where my youngest went missing on a beach, and I then had to go to the police and the guard, and you're in those panicky moments all the time, or you're worried, and you're dealing with figures of authority, and the constant question in your head is, at what point am I going to have to tell you a really intimate piece of information that I don't want to tell you, because you're then going to get obsessed with that rather than dealing with the actual situation. And that, it's really messy at the minute, because we unfortunately do not live in a society where people, unlike my children and most of their generation, people will just not accept what you tell them because it challenges their idea of what life is and what being a human is. And that's that's a side of my life that's not so much fun, or even kind of meeting people who are in Iain's life, and it's not a piece of information that I choose to tell anybody unless they really want to, unless I really need to, because I don't like the way it changes the way that people look at me,
Sure.
regardless of how well-meaning they are. If you tell them, that my body is different to a cis man's, they will instantly start to look at you differently. So I prefer just to not disclose, and I have a privilege that I don't have to disclose that information, because you can't tell unless I tell you. But then it does, and it's tricky, because there's there's at points where I might meet people in Iain's life, people that he works with, and the there's always, it's always there in the background. Most people are too polite to dig further and ask, but then it sets a worry. It does set a worry for me of going, I'm not hiding, I'm not keeping anything from you, but also I've just met this person, or I might never meet them again because it's somebody that he works with. how do we explain the fact that, you know, I've got these 4 children without having to give that piece of information?
Jack, I totally hear you. I mean, in a very, very, very small way, I go through it a lot myself, especially around my Indian South Asian community. Every time I have to go to an event where I have to meet someone, I am so anxious. You know, I hope they don't ask me these questions. I don't know how to tell them because I don't want to reveal that it's not their business. You know, you constantly go through that. But, you know, this brings me to the next question, which is on healthcare. And I'm aware of our time we've spent beautiful time, but I'm aware of it. Iain, at some point, both Jack, this question is to both you and Iain, but I'm just going to go to Iain first on this. On, you know, care homes. At some point, I don't know whether all of us ever need care homes, but I've seen in our community, I live in an apartment building that is LGBTQ affirmative. So I've seen a lot of, and which is for older people. And I've seen that a lot of us seem to require care at some point or the other, or to use the healthcare system. What do you think? Is the healthcare system equipped to handle, you know, these kind of different cases and stories?
The honest answer is no. Which, I mean, which is not, you want more than that, don't you? You want just more than no. It's not, because the healthcare system isn't mature on that basis. That it is this conformity. Healthcare. One of the problems with healthcare is that it's designed for populations and has to be delivered to individuals, and that's the big problem. It's across the board. Okay, and the problem is Iain Armstrong, Jack López are both individuals, so we might have a big system. How do you deliver for what is our appropriateness? I think it is far better, as Jack was talking there about his experiences of going to A&E with his kids and stuff like that, and losing his children on the beach, which is a bit. I mean, it's a bit irresponsible of you, Jack, just losing them on the beach and stuff like that. You left them where you didn't want to find them. That was a bad job. But I think there is this normality. There is this thing about normality that still exists, and which is deeply frustrating. Our society is built on what we perceive as being normal, which is why big structures like healthcare and social care don't really work all that well. And you know, we don't respond. It's very difficult to, because what we want in our healthcare, in our social care as we get older, is compassion. It's as simple as that. We might want really bright, educated people who can do clever stuff. But what really makes the difference is compassion, and that ability when the shit hits the fan, that somebody holds your hand because of your humanity type stuff. And I'm just reflecting back on Jack and all this sort of thing. I just know, and I know this wasn't part of your question, that I love Jack because of him. The rest of it is nothing. So when I introduce him to people, this is Jack, and that's what you want about him. But he's the bloke who is really not. I love him, and he's good fun and stuff like that. Healthcare doesn't do that. So how do we change it? There's one thing. What do we do? This is where some of the work needs to be done to raise the profile. It has to be the case, and it has to challenge the norm. So it is. And it's some of the conversations I've had with Jack, and this is one of the things that is making me think about stuff like you've just asked, that, care homes. Why not have care homes for queer folk? Why is it not like that? I mean, why would you not do that? I mean, it doesn't matter, but what needs it is where this is the norm, and what we have got is a population as old as me, but older than me, that in the 80s and the 70s and 80s, etc., that I was talking about, who might start to require that. And we have to have a response to that where people feel really comfortable, not questioning, as Jack said, filling out the forms. So what's your relationship with them? Who's your next of kin? Well, I am. Well, what do you mean you're next of kin? Well, yeah, I am. But what about the family? I mean, there is no way that anybody, if one of my brothers turned up, would I ever identify them as my next of kin? Well, there might be a legality of it. And there is this need to change that attitude of, it's a societal type of thing, but you start it with individuals. That we're not going to change the big thing. So it's starting with individuals, and I do it with work all the time, and have those conversations. And there has been a change, but it's still. I still hear stories about, she's been admitted and a partner, and it's like it's not the same type of thing. And you think, oh, for fuck's sake, it's 2025. Let's be compassionate, not clever and all this. What do we write on a bit of paper? Well, scrub out spouse or whatever it is, and partner, what, you know, those sorts of things, and be more comfortable with it. And that's why, you know, as older queer people, we've got a lot of good stuff to do, because we need to be the change that we want other people to be. That's what we need to be. That there's no point just in demonstrating. We need to demonstrate the change that we want people to be, and you know, we've got the energy and the time to do it, because it is about this thing about what happens when I get to that stage. I don't want some idiot, you know, in 15 years time, 20 years time, looking at me and saying, oh, he's a queer and stuff like that. You know, it shouldn't be part of the conversation. It's Iain Armstrong, it's Jack López, it's whatever, you know. That's all that matters, because that's what good healthcare is. You're either doing healthcare or you're not doing healthcare. You're either caring or you're not caring. End of story.
I so agree with you, Iain, because
if
I've heard
it comes with a bag of judgment, it's none of those things. None of those things at all. Absolutely not. No way whatsoever. And that imposing of this sort of heteronormative type stuff is boring. And as I say, it's why the big systems don't work, because guess what? We're all just individuals. We just respond differently to different things because we have different expectations, and we need to. It is that ability to listen. So there's a lot to do, the energy to do it, and as I've said it 3 or 4 times. We need to be the change that we want change to be.
I agree with you, and I've heard horror stories of people from 50 onwards who need, you know, care home support, or they need support from the healthcare system. They've had to go back into what they call the care closet.
Yes.
So you've spent all your life fighting for your rights and fighting to be visible, and then when you're retired or planning to retire and have a decent life, you have to go back into the closet, and that's so not right. And I've heard of care home abuse as well. You know, the Ted Brown story. You may have heard of that. So that this needs to change.
Yeah.
And Jack, on this, I wanted to ask you this question: how do you see yourself? Because I have heard of stories, and in fact, I've had people come here and tell us their stories about, especially in the trans community, where they have been hospitalized, and you know, like for example, this trans woman had to go to a male ward because that's what the healthcare professional thought that was the right thing to do, and she pleaded and begged, and that didn't happen. So do you ever have that thought or the fear that this may happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, to be completely honest, if I want to get through my day and be a happy person, this is often the type of thing that the thinking that gets pushed to the back of my mind, because they're my biggest fears. You know, your biggest fear, particularly, you know, as a trans person who has to consistently, for some reason, justify your existence to the world, is what comes along with that is the constant feeling of precarity, you know, and something that we're very seeing a lot of at the minute, you know, not just in this country but in others, is the fact that what you think are your hard-won rights apparently can be taken away from you at a moment's notice, you know. And that's not just going to stop with us. You know, that is already continuing with the broader LGBTQ community as well. You can see that in America. You can see that with people who call themselves politicians in this country who are just bigoted mouthpieces with a political agenda. And so you know, if I was to be truly honest, I am absolutely petrified. It's a feeling that it has subsided a little bit whilst I'm in a relation. You know, I'm in a relationship with an amazing person, but it also means that I've got a person. It means that I've got somebody who's likely to be able to advocate for me. You know, should that situation occur. Sometimes it worries me because there's a little bit of an age difference between us, and I worry that if Iain's health takes a turn in another 15-20 years, I don't necessarily have that person to advocate for me either. It's not even my children's responsibility. So it's It's absolutely scary. I'm scared about the fact that any day I wake up in the newspaper is telling me that I've got no right to exist anywhere anymore. It makes me feel guilty that I can hide in the shadows, whereas a lot of my, particularly a lot of women who are trans that I know don't have that choice. It makes you come up with stories about, essentially, I've met so many healthcare professionals who are so uneducated and unaware through lack of training about bodies like mine, and actually I could tell them anything at this point, that I was just born this way, and it's like they're not going to know any different. It's just like, this is what my body looks like, and there we go. And you think of all these, but if I'm half unconscious or ill or suffering, like, I don't want to even have to, the fear of even having to do that. And one of my biggest fears for me is actually around mental health and diseases like dementia as you get older as well. That's always a big fear for me, because there's no research into LGBTQ experience of dementia, and it's very scary, because it sends a lot of people back to the past where they might have been in the closet, or they, for a trans person, it might have been pre-transition. All these fears of being taken back to a place where I had no freedom, even if that's inside my head, is fearful. But the thing that makes it fearful is not that happening, is the not knowing if there are healthcare professionals who are educated and trained to be able to support somebody in that situation. There's nothing in the curriculum, in people's training, for this kind of stuff at all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I spent a long time in academia teaching doctors and teaching nurses and midwives and healthcare professionals, and because I forced topics like me into the lecture theatre. It's not on the curriculum, and that's a really scary thing.
Wow. And this is real true story, right? This is what's happening right now. So thank you for sharing that. That really touched me deeply, Jack. And just about 2 weeks ago, we had another episode where we were talking about legal matters, especially for conversations like this, where do you have a will in place? Do you have powers of attorney? For instance, if something were to happen and you were to be taken into a healthcare or hospital situation, do you have you given the right to your partner, or to the person you're dating, powers of attorney medically and powers of attorney financially? And it was surprising that a lot of people don't know about it. So that's one way to manage this, is when, if you ever need to use the healthcare system, at least you have in writing, which is a legal document which says, hey, my decisions, or my medical decisions, can be taken by my next of kin, and you name the next of kin. And there is an episode number 2 that has all this information. If anybody wants to listen to it, it's very informative, and it is quite scary, actually, that how things can happen, because we have now blended families. Our family structures have changed so much. You may have multiple children from multiple partners. How do we protect them? There's an instance of a trans person was dead named, after they passed. On their tomb, their parents decided that we are going to do this with all good intentions, but that is not what the person wanted. So paperwork is very important. And if you don't have that in place, Jack and Iain, please, you may want to consider this. I'm very aware of the time, and thank you for giving us so much time. Is it okay for me to ask you a couple of other questions? Is that you have the time?
If
All
you've
right.
got the time, yeah.
I would like to, because I think this has been such an important and real conversation. You know, how do you feel about aging within our own community? We touched upon the healthcare and the paperwork, but as a couple who's, your story doesn't fit into the traditional narrative of gay relationship or a family. So how do you navigate this part of your life together as you grow older together? Jack, you want to take that, or?
Yeah, I think it's, we're really bad at, well, I think one of the things, and I think it's a sign of how long we've been in a relationship for as well. We're still, in a lot of ways, we're still quite new. I think, for me, I think 2 years is still quite at the beginning of a relationship journey. I think we are, I think we both admit we tend to not talk about the future. I don't know for what reason. It's not come up. It's not the conversations we've had, or we're busy dealing with the present all the time, and kind of sitting with that as well. And I think that's a good thing, because part of my learning as I've got older is to, and also because I'm happy now and I don't have to, is to not obsess and worry about the future. But I do think about it. A lot of my milestones at the minute, I suppose a lot of me's thought, it's not something I'm giving a thought of, because I'm thinking about how many years it'll be before my children leave home. And I really I love to dream and imagine, that once the kids have left home, or as I often say, I will be leaving home before they do, because I don't think they're ever going to be able to afford to leave home. But I really quite like the idea of me and Iain just kind of trotting off to a house in the countryside, or by the coast, with no spare bedrooms, and just having a garden and a dog, and just kind of growing old a bit disgracefully as well, in that way. And I've met so many older gay couples over the last few years that are brilliant examples to me of actually how I'd like to be, and how I see myself and Iain, if I dare to think that far in the future with us. And I just I'm actually, and I think this goes back to some of the things that Iain said right at the beginning. I don't fear growing older, because I've got somebody to grow older with. But also, we're only just beginning, and there's so much for us to do and be together, that if anything, I'm really excited about, like, when that next phase comes along in our life, I think.
Yeah.
Fabulous. And you,
Yeah,
Iain?
I'd agree with what Jack said there. That I mean, I don't think we're not very good at talking about the future. I think what we're very good at is living in the present, and we're exploring stuff that. And one of the things I'm learning, I think, is that it's really important to secure what you have now to have a future. To learn that. So, how do you plan? It is about live. It's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? It's about living in the present. But if you're not living in the present, the future's really fragile in some ways, and we've learned that. And as you get older, one of the things that we all know is that tomorrow's never quite what you thought it was going to be. But to have things in place, as we've talked about, legalities and those sorts of things. I'm really bad at paperwork and stuff like that, and it's not because I'm just really bad at stuff like that. I mean, Jack will be surprised next time he comes here tomorrow. I've actually tidied up in this office, Jack. I've done paperwork. Okay, but I think it's just really important about thinking. You've got to be secure in the present, otherwise tomorrow is just really fragile. And I know far too many people, queer or not queer, who plan for the future, and then the future is never what it is. And part of that, I've got to say, and I keep coming back to it, and is my job has put me in front of people all the time, that I have conversations about that tomorrow's not going to be the same, because the health has changed and developed certain health issues it's you have to look. The other thing I've learned again in my job is that 2 and 2 make 4, but so does 3 and 1. Okay, there are different ways. If tomorrow's different, there are another way of doing it. And one of the things I really want to secure with Jack is that certainty that it's just good. It's good. It's mutually respectful. We understand space is important. All these 2 years is not that long. Sometimes I did wonder. Jack said a couple of times about because I'm older than him. I mean, for goodness sake, Jack, I'm not 40 years older than you, and I use a lot of moisturizer. This will last really long. This will last longer than you've got. But I understand that when we need to just stop basing when we get older. When we get to that next stage, stuff like that. I mean, how old is old these days? That when I started my nurse training in the early 60s, that was old. that's old. Okay, and now it's not. And they were talking on the news this morning about moving the pension age to 68 very quickly and stuff like that. No, that's not about being old, but what is age, and so I think it is about thinking about tomorrow. But I know too many people and too much about. It's always about tomorrow, and you miss today.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully put.
This is the certainty. Today is the bit that we actually know and enjoy that without being saying sod tomorrow. We're not doing that type of stuff.
I will say though, it was only about the second time that I met Iain and I came to his house. One of the first things he did was point to a picture on the wall and said, "That is where my ashes are going to be scattered, and I need you to know that's where they're going to be." And that was like literally the first time I'd been to his house. Okay.
So final question, I promise, final question. So what does aging well as queer people look like to you both? And if you had an ideal world and you wanted to create this huge plan for yourself, and what would community care look like as you continue your life together?
I think for me it's about not having no rules about how you're supposed to be. I mean, I'm not, my mind is still very much as it, there's still a very young Jack inside this head, and I want, I love the idea of where you and Nicola live. I love the idea of going into a community of kind of an LGBTQ older community, as long as there's enough space for me to get away from people, because people annoy me. But apart from that, I really like the idea of it, and I don't want to feel constrained or that I have to edit myself. When I still want people to understand, that we still feel desire, and that we're still, we've still got a sex drive, and that there's still all of the intimacy that's there, now is still going to be there, when I'm old. I'm very lucky to have seen my grandparents into their early 90s before they passed away. And, my nana died the other year just before their 70th wedding anniversary. So I don't, this doesn't matter whether you're queer or not. I had an example of watching two people live together into their 90s who still cuddled and danced and slept naked together, and were a couple. They weren't just my nan and granddad. They weren't just the parents of my mum and all her siblings. They were a couple who loved each other. They were romantic. They cared about each other, and I feel really privileged to have seen that, because it just makes me go, well, regardless of the fact that we're two men, that's what I want, because it was absolutely beautiful to see them live their lives that way together.
Yeah, Jack, I can see the romance here as well between you and Iain. So I think that's I can see.
Two things I'd add to what I would say. I think there's two aspects to it. One, what would it look like? I think it would look like we'd have people around us who are, Jack's alluded to it with his kids, who don't see sexuality and all that as a problem. So it'd be lovely to have that there. But this is a bigger question. As a society, we need to look after older people better, because we treat them like rubbish. That's why, when we come into winter in hospitals, we're nursing old people in corridors, and we need to have a respectful, careful look at how we as a society, because it doesn't matter whether you're queer or not. If you're on a corridor and you're dying, that is awful. You wouldn't do it to children, you wouldn't do it to animals. So there is a far bigger thing. What I'm really, one of the things you said earlier, and it's in my mind now, this thing about the care closet. I love that idea. I don't love the idea of it, but something sat in my mind thinking that needs to become something more than just a thought in my mind, but what I could potentially do. But yeah, I'd love to be surrounded by. Last week it was announced, wasn't it, by the government that 16-year-olds are going to vote. Well, good on it as well, because they're full of common sense. They're not full of sort of polluted shit that you've got adults inside it who just mess everything up. You know, I'd love that to influence politics and have a part to play and question old fuddy duddies like myself, etc. So let's have more of that sort of, you know, it's okay, it's all right, you know, okay, kids can sort of call names and stuff like that, but so can adults, and they tend to throw rockets at the same time. So more of that, and let's just be better at caring for older people, for God's sake, because we're all moving towards it in some ways, and queer or not queer, but I mean, I do like the idea of retirement, not retire, whatever retirement places of people that you know, where it is LGBTQ. I just think it's okay. It's just all right. Just it's not like a ghetto, as long as they don't become ghettos and stuff like that. But and things like that. That it's yeah. So those two things: young people, attitude, and let's just be better at caring for older people, because it's we, as a society, we have got a clue what we're doing.
It's a perfect way to end. And we started off with you saying, talking about being older, getting older is a privilege.
Yeah.
I so agree with you. And I tell everyone around me that don't complain about your life, because if you're 60, if you're 70, if you're 80, you have that privilege, you know. Many of us don't have that. And so that's a wonderful reminder. And I'm going to repeat, I see this beautiful romance between the two of you, and I think that word romance has been lost, you know, for a long time. I see a lot of older queer people actually reclaiming that in their lives as well. I've seen a lot of relationships around me, and I don't know whether, because the younger people seem to ask me a lot, saying, how have you maintained 18 years of this? You have to have patience, you have to be open to learning, you have to, there are compromises and adjustments sometimes we have to make, and we have to just not look for the next best thing, you know. We have to just be prepared to learn about each other, which is what I see you and Jack doing as well, Ian. So that's lovely, and thank you for sharing your stories, your vulnerabilities. I mean, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed my time here. You know, your stories remind us that queer lives don't stop evolving with age, they deepen, right? They expand and they continue to shape the future for us all. And I think it's so important to be great role models. And when I say great, we don't need to have the pressure of being great, about just being who we are. And that's what came across to me during this conversation: freedom to be who we are. And I think you both lived those lives. And so thank you very much.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it, loved it. It's good. It's good.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you for your
Thank
time
you.
as well, and Ian. So thank you. I'm just going to thank all our partners who have been part of this, our outreach partners. Ageism is never in style. The Views Room is the producer, Outspoken Speakers, My G Work, and Proud HR. Thank you for your partnership, and we look forward to many such conversations. And if you want to contact us, viewers, to either partner with us, participate, nominate, share feedback, or have any further questions for us, please write to us at theviewsroom@gmail.com. So until next time, take care, stay proud, and keep telling your story. And thank you again, Ian and Jack.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.